Well, good evening, everyone, and you are very welcome to the second of this year's Behind the Headlines series. And I want to begin by saying that this evening's event was organised by the Deputy Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Professor Attain Tanham, who unfortunately isn't able to be with us. But we want to, first of all, send her our very best wishes, but also to congratulate her on putting together such a superb panel of experts and people who know so much about the events of 40 years ago and how it then influenced what happened in terms of our relationship with Great Britain and with Northern Ireland in the 40 years since. The Behind the Headlines series is supported thanks to a generous endowment from the John Pollard Foundation, and it's a particular honour to be able to welcome Stephen Vernon to the event tonight. And I think what I love about tonight's event is that we have a wonderful gathering of people from across so many different areas. There's people from our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. There are people who are our own academic community of students and staff, and undergraduates and postgraduates, as well as members of our academic and administrative community, and you're all very welcome, and of course members of the public. And our role in the Trinity Long Room Hub is to serve society, and it is to act as a way of understanding, interpreting, explaining complex issues in terms of our relationship with the past, with the world today, with the challenges that we are facing. And I think the Behind the Headlines series does that so well by tackling some of these complicated, complex issues from our history, from our world, and bringing together experts and people who are involved in it and making sense of it. And I think that's absolutely wonderful as well. We do have a brilliant panel, but I also want to give a very special mention to my very good friend and colleague, Professor Lindsey Earner-Byrne, who has taken over to chair the event. And part of my vision behind this is that we have so many talented people across college that I think it's a wonderful way of showcasing their brilliance. So for our previous Behind the Headlines and the Irish presidency, we had Professor David Kenny from the School of Law. Professor Lindsey Earner-Byrne and I go back to the beginning of talking history almost 20 years ago. She is now the chair of Contemporary Irish History here in Trinity. And Dáithí was reminding me that it was actually an event here in the Trinity Long Room Hub 10 years ago, organised by Lindsey's predecessor, Professor Eamon O'Halpin, where there was an event to mark the 30th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And it was with Dáithí, one of the key people involved in that agreement, Sir Robert Armstrong, later Lord Armstrong, and Sir David Goodall, both sadly no longer with us. And I think the Anglo-Irish Agreement is such an important point in the history of our relations north and south and between us and Britain. And I think it's very appropriate that on this, the 40th anniversary, that we are marking it with this special Behind the Headlines event. So with that, I'm delighted to hand over to our wonderful chair for the evening, Professor Lindsey Earner-Byrne.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And my first and most important job was to turn on the microphone. Would be starting very poorly if I forgot that, and I'll try and keep an eye on that. You might let us know, though, if the sound quality drops. We might forget with our microphones, so do just wave a hand and don't be afraid to do so. I'd like to reiterate what Patrick said. It's a real honour to chair this, and I wish Etienne all the best. We're thinking of it this evening, but I'm also really privileged to be here to chair such an extraordinary panel and to consider such an extraordinary moment in Irish history. And with the community here this evening, it's lovely to do that. What I'm going to do is introduce the panel first, and then we're going to open the evening with a reflection by Dáithí Ó Ceallaigh here beside me on his direct experience of being involved in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, getting to that point and the work that went into that. So, and then we'll open up to a conversation among our panelists, and then towards the end, any questions that you may have as well. So I'm going to start by introducing the panel to my right. I always have to think about the right and left as well. Dr. Shelley Dean is a research fellow in the Department of Law and Government in DCU, and she's also co-editor of the Journal of Irish Studies in International Affairs and works on the Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South project. Shelley has research and practitioner and field experience in the area of peace building. fragile states, social cohesion and social integration. And I've heard her talk a little bit about the actual Anglo-Irish Agreement, the text of the agreement, and some of her analytical points are really, really interesting. So I'm really looking forward to allowing her to share those with us this evening. So thank you, Shelley, for joining us. And besides Shelley here is Sam McBride, who is the Northern Ireland editor of the Belfast Telegraph and Sunday Independent. He also writes on Northern Ireland for The Economist. He is a former political editor of the Belfast Newsletter and has made a BBC film about the Northern bank robbery. And his second book, For and Against a United Ireland, co-written with Fintan O'Toole, is published in October 2025 by the Royal Irish Academy. And his first book, we were discussing that as a story before we came up here, Burned, was on the inside story of the Cash for Ash scandal in Northern Ireland, which was one hell of a story, brilliantly told by Sam. And Sam's going to talk to us a little bit about the response of the Unionist community and the way in which the Anglo-Irish Agreement transformed, I suppose, that community and its workings in the North as well. And then I'll go to the far end to introduce Professor Michael Kerr, who is Professor of Conflict Studies at King's College London. And his forthcoming book looks at the impact of the hunger strikes on Anglo-Irish relations during this period. So it's looking at a different aspect, but an aspect that's very relevant to what we're talking about this evening. It's called The Wounded and the Dead, Margaret Thatcher, the IRA Hunger Strikes and the Northern Ireland Conflict. It's coming out with Oxford University Press, and in early summer 26, May, so quite fortuitous timing. But as I mentioned at the beginning, Dáithí Ó Ceallaigh sitting beside me here, former Irish ambassador and also a UCD graduate of history. I had to get that in there because I am also a UCD graduate from history. And we like to point out the relevance of humanities to going on to make really big and playing a big role in history. So I think it's a point I have to make given the opportunity. But Dáithí was instrumental and worked at a very grassroots level in bringing about the kind of conditions that enabled an Anglo-Irish agreement, building relationships on the ground in Northern Ireland itself, but also building really important relationships within the Irish government and the British government, and allowing those conversations to actually create a space where something like the Anglo-Irish Agreement could emerge, which is why we thought it might be a really good way to begin the discussion this evening by allowing Dáithí to reflect a little bit on that personal experience by way of opening up the discussion that we're going to have this evening. So without further ado, I shall turn off my mic and remind Dáithí to turn on his.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. When the Irish government changed at the end of 1982, Gareth Fitzgerald and Dick Spring formed a government that looked as if it would last for about 5 years. The situation in Northern Ireland was atrocious. Going back for 9 or 10 years, successive British governments had failed to produce anything like stability in Northern Ireland under various pressures, be it from the Republican movement or be it from the Loyalists. Wilson and his government had allowed Loyalists to pull down the power-sharing executive in May 1974. Roy Mason, when he became Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, his remit from Jim Callaghan was keep the lid on it, which he did in the prisons. And by the time Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, the situation in the prisons was diabolical with the dirty protest, as you know. And that was followed then by the hunger strikes. In spite of pleading from the SDLP, from the Catholic Church, from the Irish government, every Irish government, be it that of Charles Haughey or Gareth Fitzgerald, Thatcher persisted in a policy which most politicians in her own government disagreed with. The result was the election of hunger strikers to Parliament in Westminster and to the Dáil in Dublin, and 10 dead hunger strikes. So when Gareth Fitzgerald took over at the end of 1982, the situation was dire. There was a serious belief in the Dublin government, thank you, that our state was under serious threat, not to mention the chaos that existed in Northern Ireland. Unionists had proved incapable of agreeing to any sort of a system which would give any sort of power to the minority. So the government was determined to do something. And the 4 or 5 people who were centrally involved were Fitzgerald himself, Dick Spring, the leader of the Labour Party, who was Taoiseach, Peter Barry, a much underestimated politician in my view, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs, Michael Noonan, who was Minister for Justice, and 2 successive Attorneys General, Peter Sutherland and then John Rogers. And they decided really to do look at 3 aspects of what might be achieved. The first was a massive change in government policy with regard to Northern Ireland. Prior to 1982, most Irish governments, their view was a simple one. Ireland should rightfully be united. It shouldn't be divided. And it's up to the British to convince the Unionists of joining a united Ireland. And that was kept together with really doing very, very little for the problems facing the minority community in Northern Ireland. So the first thing that they decided to do, and Barry was central to this, was to try and find out what were the problems being faced by the minority. And could these problems be they of an individual nature, where a particular household or a particular person might be harassed by the UDR, or if they were of a systemic nature, could they be resolved by the Irish government talking to the British government? So immediately after that government came into power, I was asked if I would start travelling in Northern Ireland. And I travelled quite an awful lot over the next 3 years until the Anglo-Irish Agreement was concluded in 1985. And talking to people in Northern Ireland, trying to find out what their problems were, and then seeking to have those problems addressed, be it through ministers or be it through the Department of the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Anglo-Irish Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs, calling in the British Embassy and saying things had to be improved. So that was the first of 3 changes. The second was Hume wanted to ensure that the simplistic nature of the definition of Irish nationalism needed to change. Fitzgerald agreed with them, and you got the New Ireland Forum. And if you remember, the New Ireland Forum put forward 3 possibilities for a future Ireland. One was, I think, if I remember correctly, a federal or confederal Ireland. Another was joint sovereignty in Northern Ireland. A third was joint authority in Northern Ireland. And most importantly, they left room for another situation. And it was on the basis of that the Irish government was able to engage in negotiations with the British, because the Irish government and the Irish opposition, because High was part of the forum, as indeed was the SDLP, they had come together and they had all together said that the old notion of a simplistic approach to a united Ireland was no longer valid. And that unlocked the possibility of serious negotiations with the British. And then the third part was the actual negotiation with the British, which took the best part of 2 years, which was held very tightly. There were 4 or 5 senior civil servants in Dublin, led by the Cabinet Secretary. There were 2 or 3 civil servants in Britain, led by the British Cabinet Secretary. And there was a great deal of political involvement. Barry would meet with his opposite number. The Justice Secretary would meet with his opposite number. And Garrett would meet with Margaret Thatcher every time there was an EU Council. Those ministerial meetings in Brussels were wonderful, because every time there was a ministerial meeting, the relevant British and Irish ministers met for half an hour or an hour in private, and business could be done together. So on the basis of those three issues, engagement with the nationalists in the north, a redefinition of Irish nationalism, and an engagement with the British over a period of about 2 years in intensive negotiations, we reached the Anglo-Irish Agreement in November 1985, approximately 40 years from now. As a result of that agreement, I'll just say it very briefly, as a result of that agreement, there was an Anglo-Irish conference established at ministerial level, which at the beginning met every 4 or 5 weeks. And the issues which would be raised at those ministerial conferences, the British were under an agreement in the Anglo-Irish Agreement to make determined efforts to reach agreement. There was a secretariat, an Anglo-Irish secretariat established in Merryfield, just outside Belfast. I went into that secretariat early in December 1985, and I worked in it for almost 2 years until I left it in August 1987. And we built up a relationship with our British colleagues, and even more importantly, with Northern Irish civil servants right across the board to do business. And it was, in my view, it was absolutely historic, because here was one country, the Republic of Ireland, being asked by another country, the United Kingdom, to come into its own territory and to help it rule its own territory for the benefit of the minority in Northern Ireland. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dáithí. That was a great idea. You mentioned so many things that I want us to touch on in the course of the conversation, both from the idea of just going in there and figuring out what the minority needed, what the experience was, that kind of groundwork that had to be done, but also the redefining of Irish nationalism. In what way was the Irish government willing to part with certain ideas and think differently about nationalism itself? But I wonder, Michael, if you would mind coming in and just talking to us a little bit about the context. If British-Irish relations were at this nadir, were in such a bad place, why were they? What was the kind of context?
Okay, thank you, Lindsey, and thank you, Patrick, and also to Attain. It's a real pleasure to be here. Part of me wishes I'd studied history at Trinity as well, but as a teenager from Belfast, my only thought in 1990, if you can excuse it, was to get off this island as quickly as possible. But I'm here. I am back. And yes, the context to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, we need to go back to the Heath government in 1970 to 74. Heath, prorogued Stormont and charged William Whitelaw, who was Northern Ireland's first Secretary of State, a bit like a colonial viceroy in Stormont, with sorting out the mess and ending direct rule within about 18 months. And Bloody Sunday was the catalyst for that intervention, because instead of being setting alarm bells ringing in Washington and Dublin and in the Labour Party, the British government was under pressure after Bloody Sunday to do something and to act. And of course, Sunningdale failed. The Irish government was not able to deliver the constitutional things that the Unionists wanted. There wasn't a great unity of purpose between the two administrations. Heath's view was that there was nothing that good management couldn't resolve, and that was his attitude towards the peace process. Whereas Whitelaw was more cerebral and saw the nuances and worked out pretty quickly on the back of a cigarette packet a power-sharing agreement. But it failed, and as Dáithí has pointed out, it was brought down by a very unconstitutional, un-British coup. Fast forward to 1979. Well, the Conservatives returned to office. And what lessons had they learnt, had the Conservatives learnt from Heath's government? Well, the lessons that the Conservative Party essentially had learnt was that the 1970 manifesto was the right one. Monetarism, break the unions, put Britain back on the map, and you know, finish the decolonization process, and you know, think about a new Britain. And as William Whitelaw said to her whenever he became Home Secretary and de facto Deputy Prime Minister, and Sunningdale. And she was not cognizant of this, but he said that he convinced her that the price for ending the violence in Northern Ireland was to give the Irish government a political role in Northern Ireland's affairs. Thatcher was pretty disturbed by that idea, as she was about handing over Rhodesia to ending the Rhodesian Bush War and doing what Peter Carrington, Lord Carrington, suggested, which was to end it through compromise. The same with the Falklands. That was on the British government's agenda, and Northern Ireland and Hong Kong. And she was expected, in her intra in 1979, she was expected to do something with all of those briefs. Coming on the scene at the same time was Charles Haughey, flamboyant entrance to the international scene with his teapot diplomacy in May 1980, wooing the populist Thatcher, promising her an end to Irish neutrality, perhaps even joining NATO, exploring the totality of relations between these in these islands, and of course breaking the IRA as a political and fighting force, something which she was currently doing in the prisons. This is before the hunger strikes. And in December, during the first hunger strike, they agreed to do just that. So there's a very clear quid pro quo for Thatcher. And the Unionists are terrified because this is all in secret. And they're very frightened that Lord Carrington is in Dublin with Thatcher in December 1980, talking about Anglo-Irish relations and the Northern Irish conflict. And there are discussions ongoing at the same time, at the very point, about maintaining a British way of life in the Falkland Islands, whilst allowing the Argentina to have some control there. The hunger strikes run their course. As Dáithí has said, it's disastrous for Anglo-Irish relations. Anglo-Irish relations plummet. The Haughey-Thatcher process comes to nothing. Haughey takes out his frustration, but uses the Northern Ireland card in his second stint as government to try and gain a mandate, instead of through agreement with Thatcher, this time through bashing Thatcher and lining up against her and opposing her in Europe and opposing her at the UN during the Falklands campaign. So Anglo-Irish relations really fail at that point. And the Anglo-Irish Agreement really is, if you think of the Anglo-Irish process as a game of snakes and ladders from the period of direct rule in 1972, it's at the bottom of the ladder, the bottom of the snake in 1983, 1984, and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, you know, sets it back in its context. It says to the Unionists, any form of government in Northern Ireland that doesn't take account for the minority's position, for the Catholic community's position, the nationalist community, simply isn't worth having. And until you get that, accept that idea, there will be no devolution, and the Irish government will have a role in Northern Ireland's affairs through Maryfield, and until that fourth option is explored.
Thanks, Michael. You talked there about the Falklands War and the relationship being at a real low point. How then do we get from that kind of Thatcher-Haughey relationship that soured? And I think the Falklands was really, really damaging to that relationship. How do we get from there then to a situation where you can have a reset? What is it that changes? Dáithí, do you want to come in, or Shelley? Anybody who'd like to pick that up?
Well, I mean, you do it through building up relationships, and as I mentioned to you, I mean, the Irish government was very careful about what they were doing, and they were very determined to do it. And they felt that the way to engage her was to reinvent, if you want to put it, whatever way you want to put it, but to change the nature or change the definition of Irish nationalism. So that, and she had a soft spot for Fitzgerald. By the way, she had a very good relationship with Haughey at the beginning.
She liked the teapot.
She liked the teapot very much. And the totality of relationships that they talked about at those meetings in, I think it was 79, 80, or maybe it was 80, 81, they were fruitful. It was oversold in Dublin was the problem. And then the Falklands, of course, was dreadful. But, you know, you just have to work at it. And
Was Garrett Fitzgerald coming in, was that relationship important?
yes, very.
And can I just push you on another thing, and maybe Shelley, if you come in on this too. When you're talking about the redefinition of Irish nationalism, what was Irish nationalism up to that point, and how did they redefine it?
Well, I'm going to be very...
In short.
I'm going to be very simple.
Yeah.
Irish nationalism consisted of Irish nationalists standing on a soapbox saying Ireland should be united and it's up to the British to persuade the Unionists. It was nonsense. It was never going to work.
Okay.
What we did in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and you can see it on Article 1, the two governments affirm that any change in the status of Northern Ireland would only come about with the consent of a majority of people in Northern Ireland. That was a fundamental change on the part of the Irish government. And had the Anglo-Irish Agreement gone a little bit further, I think the Irish government at that stage might well have had the referendum to change Articles 2 and 3. They didn't feel in 1985 that they had enough to do it.
Which made claims to the territorial space.
Yeah.
Shelley, do you want to come in and maybe flesh that out a little bit, that redefinition of nationalism and the importance of that, what that article says in terms of a shift in imagining what nationalism can be?
So I suppose that Dáithí, he read out the first article of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which the crucial part about that is the letter A, and that it's not the definite article the. So it's not the consent of the majority. It's the consent of a majority. So it refers to a majority in Northern Ireland, not the majority at the time. And that change in language is part and parcel of the change in language, which helps with the notion of changing Irish nationalism. The agreement and the notion of changing Irish nationalism comes to the New Ireland Forum that was established by the Irish nationalist parties and the SDLP and the Workers' Party. And as many parties as got together that on condition that they adhered to a non-violent approach, which meant it ultimately excluded Sinn Féin in any discussion around the New Ireland Forum. They also invited the Northern Irish Party, Unionist parties, but they weren't terribly enthused, as you can imagine at the time. So Irish nationalism, the idea was ultimately to try and create a space for Irish nationalism that would give an opportunity for Unionists not to feel so excluded by it. And that's something that Garrett Fitzgerald is quoted as saying in Owen O'Malley's new book, Garrett and Charlie, or Charlie and Garrett. Anyway, it's the two of them. And he talks about how Garrett realized that there was a need to be able to make Irish nationalism less brittle and more elastic and dynamic, to be more inclusive. But in order to do that, you need to kind of set the parameters. And that's why the Anglo-Irish Agreement is different to the Good Friday Agreement, because the Anglo-Irish Agreement is more of a collude to exclude arrangement, if you'll forgive the phrase collude, just bear with me. By that, I mean that it was an agreement by the two governments to set in place parameters that would enable and allow greater space for the moderate middle. And in so doing, exclude Unionists, probably a little bit too much, but exclude Unionists and the leverage they had with their veto, and Irish Republicans on the other side. So if you know the song Stuck in the Middle with You, this is kind of where the two governments were at. But it's worth noting that they weren't just stuck with one another, they were stuck in the middle with the EU. And as Dáithí referred to, it was really important that the EU was a platform or a space for the officials and the ministers to get together and talk about issues pertaining to Northern Ireland, particularly in the 2-3 years of these arduous negotiations, where more was decided in Stuttgart than anywhere else by virtue of our shared membership. So why is the Anglo-Irish Agreement a collude to exclude arrangement? It allows for the parameters to be put in place to be able to make things move a little bit further with the two governments. They had two different agendas ultimately, and those agendas didn't change, but they learned to accommodate. The British government wanted assistance and help with the security parameters of Northern Ireland. Cross-border security is a perpetual problem, but sometimes it's more difficult than others. And this was a particularly poor era for cross-border security. In 1976, the SAS had crossed the border and there were public trials. It was all very awkward. So cross-border dynamics were really uncomfortable in terms of security. The amount of time, energy, finances, and bureaucratic time taken around Northern Ireland was extensive. I was telling my colleagues earlier that if you look at the cabinet minutes for 1978 to 1990, if you're I'm not a historian, but I think I should be as well. If you look at the cabinet minutes from 78 to 1990, Scotland is mentioned 19 times. Wales is mentioned twice if you exclude the Waleses, whole other story, especially this week. And Northern Ireland is mentioned 109 times. So the bureaucratic weight of Northern Ireland, the burden, if you like, was something that Britain wanted help with, not least in terms of security, and specifically in terms of security. From the Irish side, the issue around Irish nationalism and the sense of alienation of the minority in Northern Ireland was a crucial issue. So the Irish government wanted to be able to be involved in consultations around what was happening in the north with the Catholic minority, the nationalist minority. And so there was an equation, and the negotiators called it an equation. So the equation was, from Margaret Thatcher's perspective, security, and from the sort of robust Irish Republican position, Irish nationalist stroke Republican position would have been sovereignty, so access and resources, so security to sovereignty. Or if you like, from the Garret FitzGerald perspective, it would be involvement and recognition of the union. So we'll recognize the union if you let us get involved in trying to remove the alienation felt by Irish nationalists in the north. So the agreement was nearly a multiple-tiered negotiation, because you have factions within factions. The constellation of actors is really interesting. So you end up having really interesting dynamics where Garret FitzGerald said that, laughed when he said that, Margaret Thatcher said that she liked me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I liked her. And he laughed. I thought it was great. He said that he found it really interesting when Armstrong and David Goodall encouraged him to convince Thatcher of the dynamics that were required to encourage her to agree with the proposals in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Rarely, if ever, are civil servants or bureaucrats on the same page in such a way as to convince the principal from the other side to help with the discussion and the negotiation and the conversation. So this is an unusual negotiation, first and foremost. The officials are all utterly and thoroughly committed and still don't necessarily move positions. So they meet one another where they are, which is crucial for any kind of diplomacy, but they're very effective at it. What does that mean in terms of the results? So what do we get with the Anglo-Irish Agreement? We get a collude to exclude arrangement, which is exclusive. It's between two governments. It excludes those who participate in non-constitutional activities. It excludes those who are unwilling to talk, who are not involved in extra judicial activities. So it excludes both the Unionists and Irish Republicans. And it creates a minimal bargain, if you like, support and assistance over security, and how that can shape and encourage an institutional engagement with the Irish government addressing the challenges in Northern Ireland. So it sets up an institutional framework, one which is, Dáithí spoke to it in Murrayfield and the connection. And the role of the EU is not to be missed here. It's the reason it was called the Anglo-Irish
Secretariat.
Thank you. It's because the term council and the term commission were just too EU-y. So Britain didn't like EU phrases and terms. So there's something really interesting around the language that gets chosen in different spaces around this agreement. And it gives us an insight into how other subsequent agreements are manifest after the Anglo-Irish Agreement. What strikes me about how significant it is the relationships between the actors and particularly the officials in the midst of the much fated Chequers arrangement. So there's a meeting at Chequers after which everything falls apart. It's worth noting that this is like a drama in 3 parts. The negotiations fall apart and come together and fall apart and come together at different times, and it's very uncertain. But after Chequers, there's in the midst of Chequers, Thatcher refers to people she couldn't trust, and it kind of fell on silence in the dining room. And David Goodall, one of her chief advisors, said, "I hope you're not referring to officials." And sorry, Garrett Fitzgerald said, "I hope you're not referring to our officials." And she said, "No, I love our officials." And the room was stung because she rarely said something quite so generous. But what was so significant about that is that when Chequers falls apart, so they agree on what they agree on and they separate, and Garrett Fitzgerald comes back and gives presentations to the officials, to the press, that are terrible, because he doesn't realize that Thatcher is giving her not her speaks in relation to what she wasn't willing to accept. So Thatcher gets hardened in her press conference, whereas Garrett is much more conciliatory. And then he gets beaten up at home, not physically, I mean metaphorically. Specify that. He antagonizes and undermines him by virtue of this division. After that, Robert Armstrong sends, Noel Dorr sends, who's the Irish ambassador at the time, sends David Goodall a poem from Auden about negotiators and about how the soldiers are waiting on any word to go to war, which ultimately undermines everything and people die. So the language around negotiation is really significant, and that's what sets the Anglo-Irish Agreement apart from anything that had come prior. And I'm minded of what George Mitchell said at the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in Belfast. He said, "War is a shallow escape from the problems and puzzles of peace." And if you want to know how those problems and puzzles are best manifest, the Anglo-Irish Agreement gives us a really rich insight into how bureaucrats, officials, and principals like prime ministers and Taoiseach manage these kinds of issues.
Just to come in on that, because I think you mentioned about language and that Thatcher was uncomfortable and didn't find the word alienation very helpful and so on, and the work that went into changing that language. But you also talk about things falling apart and coming back together again and falling apart, which is something that I think is really distinctive about this, which is the human hours that went into smaller relationships that meant that when it hit a crisis, there were enough like conversations happening across the spectrum. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about those other players. So not necessarily Thatcher and Gareth Fitzgerald, but the other people who were working those relationships. And Dáithí, you mentioned that you spent almost, was it 2 years, going up to the north and speaking to just about everybody who wasn't involved in violence to try and actually get a sense of, just to actually get some critical information, but you also made these relationships. Talk to us a little bit about those, the bureaucratic relationships, but also the community relationships, those relationships that meant that the crisis, when they hit, didn't mean the end of the kind of longer term negotiation.
Okay, but let me say something first about the out. I think I said earlier on that, you had these three possibilities in the report of the New Ireland Forum, and then it was open to other possibilities. She wasn't necessarily aware of all that detail. She certainly didn't want to upset Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald, when he had his press conference in the embassy, she had hers, I think, in Chequers. And he didn't know what she had said. And it was some of the journalists who asked him, who told him. And so he was very flummoxed and he was very upset. And we persuaded him, the Irish civil servants who were there, that this is a golden opportunity. She's damaged you, and she didn't want to, and she now owes you. And it was just in a period of maybe 3 to 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks, that the whole dynamic changed. Over that Christmas and into very early in the new year, the dynamic had changed because she realized that she had damaged Fitzgerald politically in Ireland, and that she didn't want to do. And then we were greatly helped by Reagan, who said to her, Margaret, my 2 best friends are the United Kingdom and Ireland, and I really don't like you having problems together. That's all he said. So, I mean, the dynamic changed. Now, to go back to the second part of your question, the whole negotiation was informed by what we were finding out in Northern Ireland and what needed to be repaired in Northern Ireland. And so we were building up, and Peter Barry was critical here. We were building up relationships, not only with the SDLP, but with nationalists in Northern Ireland who were neither SDLP nor Republicans. We were building up relationships with people who were working with prisoners, or with people who were very concerned about problems that they were having with the UDR. And Peter Barry was persuading people in Northern Ireland that we could actually do something about their problems by taking them up with the British. So that's what we were looking for.
So it was as important to get the trust of that community.
It was very important. And I remember when I went from Belfast to New York, and New York was a hive of Irish Northern aid. And I remember asking the then Foreign Minister, who was Brian Linehan, the older Brian Linehan, why are you sending me to New York? Because I had been publicly attacked, not by name, but everybody knew who it was, by PJ Mara after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, as an Irish civil servant who had done things in Northern Ireland that no civil servant should do. And I was a bit concerned about it, to be honest with you. So when they decided to send me to New York, I asked the minister, why are you sending me to New York? Because we want you to deal with Irish Northern aid, quote unquote. And it was very interesting when I got to New York, because my predecessor would be heckled anytime he wanted to give a speech. They didn't necessarily agree with me, but they listened. And they listened because they knew the Irish government, whether they agreed with them or not, that Fitzgerald government was trying to do something about the plight of nationalists in Northern Ireland. It's all of this, working with people in this, and there are many people in this room who know this. It's a question of building up trust, building up respect, trying to find out what people want and see, can you find solutions that everybody can agree to, or everybody can accept, rather more than agree to.
I'm aware of one community we haven't really discussed. I'm going to ask you, Sam, to come in a bit on that. And that is the Unionist community. So both leading up to this from 83 to 85, but actually during the Anglo-Irish negotiations, and all this work and communication and relationship building is happening, what's happening within the Unionist community? Can you fill us in a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, at a political level, there is what in retrospect is clear as a great naivety, a great trust from unionism, which will be very familiar to all of us because we've seen it in Brexit, where unionists were believing of what they were being told by the British government. They felt that Margaret Thatcher was a conviction unionist, which I think she was, and so therefore she would not do what some people were suggesting to them privately maybe was going on, because there were some leaks. There was a sense that something was happening here, even if it wasn't. It was being kept quite tightly in terms of what exactly it was. And so the opposition of unionism as it came to be expressed very publicly after the agreement emerged publicly, I suppose was founded on two central planks. The first was a point of principle that they didn't like the Irish government having a formal say in Northern Ireland. That was something they just didn't accept. But the second thing which amplified the level of betrayal around that was that they had been cut out of this. So they had no role in this whatsoever. So at a very late stage, Margaret Thatcher did try to involve Jim Mullineux, the elderly and quite docile, frankly, leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, by bringing him in and saying to him on privy councillor terms, i.e. we can talk about this, but you can't talk about this outside this room. I will give you an update on what we're doing. And he said, no, I don't want to be told that. So if that was the plan, that would be how she would manage him, there was no plan B, because from then on, there was nothing effectively. And so I suppose if you think about this, sometimes it's helpful to think about things in reverse to try to understand how people think about something. And if Ireland had never been partitioned in 1921, if there was a united Ireland, and we got to the early 1980s and there was serious violence in the northeast of the island, and there was a decision taken by the then Irish government to bring in the British government and give it a say in what happened in 6 counties of Ireland, and didn't tell nationalists in Northern Ireland or what is now Northern Ireland that was going to happen, and suddenly announced this. It's not hard to see why those people would be a bit annoyed by that, to put it mildly. And so you had that really, to a significant extent, exacerbated by the fact that Unionists had been ruling the roost for the first 50 years after partition had happened in 1921, and that they had this record of being able to wreck other things. They'd wrecked Sunningdale, as Michael says, and he's written a fine book about this period, by thoroughly unconstitutional means, by cutting off the power supplies, by threatening people, by intimidating people out of their jobs, etc. So they had done that before, and there was this latent sense of ability to get their way, frankly, in simple terms. And so the real significance, I think, for unionism of 1985 is that this is the first time where that doesn't happen. Now, that's a very obvious point, but it is very significant. And when you come to David Trimble, when you come to ultimately Peter Robinson and the late Ian Paisley, and their reasons for going into power sharing in very different circumstances with very different people who they liked even less than the people who might have been on offer in 1985, this was at the back of their minds. In fact, it was at the front of their minds. They knew that if they didn't do this, the alternative wasn't simply direct rule from London. It was direct rule from London with some sort of green tinge to it, some sort of Irish dimension that was formalised. Now, you could say that the Irish dimension had been recognised by the British government right the way from at least 1974, but this was making it more formalised, and it was very specific, it was very explicit, and it was in their faces in Belfast, in Merryfield, in this office, where there'd be a joint Irish secretary, a joint British secretary. They would meet together daily sometimes, certainly at a point of crisis, but have these regular institutionalized meetings. And that was something which they didn't like. But the final thing about this is that the significance of this from a unionist perspective is that they really threw the kitchen sink at trying to wreck this. Short of resorting to widespread paramilitary violence, which did happen from the paramilitaries, but in terms of mainstream unionism did not for the most part. Short of doing that, they did basically everything you could do to try to express your displeasure at something in a democratic society. So they refused to pay their council rates. They resigned their seats as MPs in Westminster. They had mass street rallies. I mean, really mass street rallies. The famous one, obviously, where Ian Paisley did say no, no, no. It was absolutely everything. They then took it a bit further, and people in the DUP set up a paramilitary organisation, albeit they were very uneasy about that. So you had this sort of bizarre situation where Paisley promised them behind closed doors, but it was recorded by somebody in the Ulster Hall that there was no extent to which they would go, that he would not back them. But then, of course, once they're caught with guns, he immediately disowns them and says that he had no idea this was going on. So you really get this thrashing around from unionism, desperately trying to work out how do we stop this. And at the end of all that, the leadership of Ulster Unionism is weakened because they have been seen to be pretty thick, and they've missed all of this. Also, the integrationist tendency within unionism, which was represented by Enoch Powell and by Jim Molyneux, who were dominant really in many ways at that point, is massively weakened because their idea is that you give more power essentially to London, you trust these people even more. Well, hang on a minute, they've just betrayed you. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so you've really got this very confused picture within unionism. But ultimately, and sorry, there's the final thing I'll say about this, is that there is often, I think, a point missed about this from nationalism and from republicanism in particular. As Dáithí has said, the old idea of Irish nationalism was, basically Brits out, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. You might not agree with it, but you know what it is. But the slightly more sophisticated version of that Gerry Adams certainly preached right up until the Good Friday Agreement and tried to get this into the Good Friday Agreement, didn't succeed, was that you would get the British government to be persuaders for unity, basically put pressure on the Unionists, use financial means to clobber them, use cultural means, whatever it is, try to rationally persuade them, but also try to really put the screw on them. And that was never really going to work. It fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between London and Belfast in terms of unionism and the British government. However, what happened in 1985 meant that that was completely untenable. So the idea that the British government had any sort of cachet with unionists, that they could just tell them what to do, was obviously ludicrous. These people were basically rioting in the streets in places. They were certainly marching in the streets in other places, and they were loudly denouncing what had gone on. So you had this very messy outcome where unionism had lost comprehensively. The British government didn't really get what it wanted because the big carrot of security guarantees didn't really materialise, certainly in terms of getting extradition sorted out from their perspective. And so ultimately, this does push unionism towards the Good Friday Agreement. But I think in retrospect, it's not a surprise that it takes a long time to get there because it's such an unpleasant thing for unionists from their perspective in trying to work through what has happened and where the logic of that pushes them towards in the future.
Thanks, Sam. What you were saying there about the degree to which they were in the picture, and I love this idea of Molly, you say, don't finish that sentence, don't tell me what I don't know, I can't deny. But at the civil service level, so how does this work in Belfast? I mean, if you kept not just the political parties out, but also their equivalent civil servants out from the unions community, how did that work then after?
Well, I think that is one of the great weaknesses of the agreement, that while it's an extraordinary piece of diplomacy between these two states, which we're trying to build trust, we're trying to put in place very complex structures, which were durable, they did survive all the way up to the Good Friday Agreement when they were superseded by different structures, which did quite similar things in some ways. There was this gap. And you can make a deal over people's heads, but ultimately it only takes you so far. So you cut out the majority of the people in Northern Ireland who were very annoyed at this, very angry at this. It's not necessarily going to immediately push them towards power sharing. It did ultimately do that, but it was not. It was something which got their backs up. And I think one of the most interesting things I remember coming across in the British declassified files several years ago when they were opened up for the first time was this memo from Sir Ken Bloomfield, who was, I think at the time, one of the two permanent undersecretaries in the NIO, but he was head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. The most significant Mandarin in the history of Northern Ireland, the Northern T.K. Whitaker, if you like, somebody who had massive influence over many decades, who was there at Sunningdale, who was there right the way in some ways up to the Good Friday Agreement. He had left the civil service by that point, but he was involved in trying to resolve victims' issues, different other things, and he's cut out of this completely. He doesn't get a whiff of this, and he's furious about it. He's really angry, and this is a very eloquent man, a very articulate man, and he writes this memo, and I find this fascinating in our culture of instant gratification, of, tweeting it, of, going on the BBC, going on RTE, whatever it might be, calling a press conference. He doesn't do any of that. He does this very discreetly, very properly within the British system, and he files this away, and it sits there for 35 years or whatever it was, and then suddenly I'm opening this old file, and there it is. And he's really annoyed about this. But the other thing about this that's really interesting is that there's a second memo from him sometime later. I can't remember exactly how long. And things by then are very much pushing towards violence, pushing towards a very destabilised situation. And there are rumblings in the media in Belfast, some of the papers, that civil servants might refuse legitimate orders, that there might be a sort of return to what happened in 1974. Not that happened in 1974, but a form of unconstitutional methods to try to wreck the agreement. And Sir Ken Bloomfield sends this memo to his permanent secretary colleagues and asks them to then speak to all of their staff in the various departments, making clear that this is a democratic decision of a legitimate government which has sovereignty. We might not like what they've done over our heads as unionists from his perspective, and he really was somebody who was very much pro-union, but this is legitimate and it would be wrong for us not to implement this. And so he then went on with his colleagues to largely work this pretty well, but by cutting out that expertise, somebody who understood unionism, who might have been able to just have some nuance in terms of how this was presented, I think there was a loss there from the outset where they were on the back foot trying to explain this. Having said that, if unionism had been involved before this, they would never have signed up to it. So I totally understand why they were cut out, but it created a problem that then had to be overcome later on.
They're very lucky that he took that attitude to actually implementing it, and because it could have been very different if it had a different personality in that key position. Dáithí, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I've seen the memo as well, and Ken Broomfield, with whom we used to meet very regularly, always complained about the fact that he felt he had been cut out of it. It was a British decision. We weren't aware of it. We actually thought that Jim Molyneux was being informed through the Privy Council of what was happening. But it was a British decision taken not only to cut out Ken Bloomfield until towards the end, but they also cut out the Northern Ireland office, which was part of the British government. Northern Ireland wasn't involved. What is significant, and the most significant thing, and this is why I wanted to come in, was that Ken Bloomfield and the Northern Ireland Civil Service, on the one hand, and the Northern Ireland office on the other, they were quite different. The Northern Ireland Civil Service worked the agreement. Ken Bloomfield appointed a very senior member, he was number 2 actually, to coordinate with the Secretariat. I was his opposite number, in setting up all sorts of meetings between, for example, the Ministry of Health in Northern Ireland and the Ministry of Health in Dublin, just to work on practical affairs, to work on things like education or whatever it was. Cross-border affairs where cross-border was done. They came into the Secretariat, and the meetings between Dublin and Belfast officials took place practically every day of the week in the Secretariat. So the Northern Ireland Civil Service took a decision to work it. So also did Jack Herman, the Chief Constable of the RUC. Jack was one of the first people to come into the Secretariat to have dinner with us and to talk with us. And he used to come in regularly to have a chat about the problems which the police were having. And there were very many meetings, and Faulkner, you may have been at some of those meetings in the Secretariat between the Guards and the Northern Ireland and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, very regular, to sort out security matters and try and make better forms of communication and so on. The same was also true of Northern Ireland ministers, including even Tom King, who had been convinced by the Northern Ireland, the NIO Permanent Secretary, Robert Andrew, who hated the agreement, by the way, and continued to hate the agreement all the while he was in Northern Ireland. But Tom King came into the Secretariat for dinner, and he changed his views, and he started to work the agreement and became quite friendly with Peter Barry after a while. So it was perfectly understandable that Ken Bloomfield felt as he felt. For a person of his reputation, his capacity, his commitment to public service, to have been kept out of that negotiation, I find actually quite strange. But it was a British decision. We were not aware of it. And it did not in any way affect the manner in which Northern Ireland civil servants, even though many of them were unionists and they didn't like us at the beginning, how they and the Northern Ireland Police, how they worked the agreement. And they came after a while, they began to realise that we didn't have horns on our heads. We were not there to take over Northern Ireland. We were there to try and work with them to make Northern Ireland a place in which nationalists could live in a better way than they had previously. I'll give you one example of a minister doing it. Some of you may know Navan Fort outside Armagh, which is a very important historical place, and it figures centrally in the Dáithí Ó Ceallaigh. Cardinal O'Fee and others, but particularly Cardinal O'Fee, was very concerned about the fact that quarrying was going on around Navan Fort. It was a Catholic, by the way, who was doing the quarrying, and that the historic importance of the fort would be lost. And many people, but particularly the Cardinal, had complained, firstly to the local council and got nowhere, and secondly to the Department of the Environment and got nowhere. So it was one of the issues that we raised in the Secretariat. And we asked Richard Needham, who was the junior minister, to come in and have dinner with us one night. And he was responsible for the environment in Northern Ireland. And we gave him a copy of Thomas Kinsella's translation of the Dáithí Ó Ceallaigh. He was a very cultured man. His title, by the way, was Irish. and that one with the lovely drawings of Louis Le Brocq. 3 weeks later, he took a personal decision to stop the quarrying around Navan Fort. Working with Northern Ireland civil servants, Divis Flats was taken down as a result of what went on in that secretariat. So in spite of the difficulties which unionists working in the Northern Ireland civil service, and most of them were unionists, in spite of the fact that they felt that they'd been betrayed, they did work the agreement, as did the police.
Michael, did you want to come in there?
Yes, thanks. On the Ken Bloomfield point, it was rather ironic that he was excluded because with the Taoiseach, Garret FitzGerald, which was very unusual for the Taoiseach to meet an official, you know, he renegotiated the Sunningdale Agreement in the early months of 1974. But his exclusion and the Northern Ireland Civil Services exclusion speaks to Thatcher's insecurity. The Northern Ireland Civil Service was irrelevant almost. She didn't trust the NIO. She didn't trust the Foreign Office. She didn't trust the Unionists. She didn't trust hockey. She didn't trust the SDLP. And this is where Garret FitzGerald is so historically important. Because, you know, he wasn't the populist sportsman like Jack Lynch or the flamboyant Taoiseach like Charlie Haughey, but he was a man of considerable integrity. So by 85, late 85, Thatcher, FitzGerald was in the circle of men around her like Robert Armstrong, Dermot Nally, Willie Whitelaw, that she actually trusted and you know, believed in. And of course, FitzGerald had, you know, he was coming of age as a powerful Taoiseach with a mandate, but he had gone through a great deal of learning because he failed in 1974. The Sunningdale Agreement was his failure. His coalition wasn't strong enough to you know, create an Anglo-Irish agreement with Ted Heath's government, where they were, you know, working with a unity of purpose to deliver a peace agreement. What they delivered was a peace agreement, which was an executive which excluded other parties in the absence of a ceasefire, whilst violence was going on, Unionist and Loyalist. So by 1985, he was the man in the seat that was convincing Thatcher to do something that she saw very little reason that she should do. The IRA had attempted to murder her the year before in Brighton through the Brighton bombing. They'd killed Lord Mountbatten and Erin Neve, her friend, who would have been Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And she'd cut her teeth through the hunger strikes and the Falklands fiasco. So, you know, you were asking a British Prime Minister who was at the height of her power to engage in a political agreement that was not a peace agreement. It was an agreement between two states that had no obvious short-term, medium-term or long-term gains for her. The quid pro quo that she wanted, which was a security pact, which Haughey gave her, which would break the IRA, was no longer on offer. And she'd looked at that whole period and looked at the Irish government as a very unreliable ally, because you have successive changes of government in 79, 80, 81, 82, and the Irish state looks very unstable. And here was Garret FitzGerald saying to her in private, look, Margaret, we don't really want a political role in Northern Ireland, never mind a security role. We need to do this to contain the contagion of the IRA and to secure the Republic and to shore up the SDLP and to make sure politics in Northern Ireland doesn't fail, so that whenever there's a ripe moment again in the future, there is a political process in which to deliver a peace agreement. So, I mean, it was a very hard sell. Now, why? Just finally, why did she sign it? Because the devolved government had failed. The agreed Ireland had failed. Sinn Féin was gaining at the ballot box. the SDLP was in a sort of emotional distress, and she had a Taoiseach she could do business with and an Irish government that she could trust. And that was enough.
Yeah, just thinking about your hard sell, I was looking at Charles Moore's biography of her, and his reading of it is kind of strange, but he comes down on the idea that she regretted it. You know, that she ultimately came to look back on that as a negative thing, which is extraordinary, really, because actually it showed quite tremendous courage. Because from her point of view, the Brighton bomb was so catastrophic, and so the sell was hard, but the fact that she regretted it, I think, is kind of unfortunate in the end. I'm aware of our time and I want to be able to open to the floor for questions. So I just want to give our speakers an opportunity. If anybody would like to maybe say one last thing before we open it to the floor, anything. Shelley.
Just to reiterate what Michael has been saying, not for the first time. Thatcher moved so radically because when it was first put to her that there was an opportunity to do something with the Irish government, she ended up poking a fire and suggested, as she was poking the fire, seemingly, the first thing she suggested was, well, can't we navigate the border and gerrymander the border? The second thing she said was, what about a Berlin Wall? What about a wall like Berlin? And the third thing she said was, well, population transfer, didn't they have one of those recently? And they said the room fell suitably silent. And David Goodall said, are you referring to Cromwell? And she went, well, yes. And needless to say, it was never mentioned again. But the point is, she went from there to signing an agreement with Gareth Fitzgerald, not with anyone else. And I think that reiterates Michael's point.
And that is the one thing that does come across in the Charles Moore biography, although it's quite negative and in lots of respects. He does talk about the position, the kind of the level of her ignorance, her disengagement, her kind of antipathy towards Northern Ireland, and yet her unionist sensibilities as well, and that she moved from there. It is quite extraordinary, and it does seem really to come down to not just the relationship between Gareth Fitzgerald and her, because I think that was really important, but the work that the men and women underneath Gareth Fitzgerald and Thatcher herself did to build relationships and convince both sides that these were two people they could trust. There was hours and hours and hours of relationships went into that. Anybody else would like to?
I think firstly, the Unionists eventually came to realise that the only way forward was actually to try and have a devolved government and share power with the minority. John Hume was able to use it eventually to persuade the Provisionals that there was a political way forward for them, that they didn't have to continue their military stuff. But what had really changed, in my view, and it's the most fundamental thing of all, is that it changed the relationship between London and Dublin. And it was a milestone on the way to peace.
Sam, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just to say that we're thinking about this in historical terms now, obviously, and one of the things that strikes me is how quickly key unionist figures come to change their minds about this. This was partially known at the time, but it's much more fully known now as we've seen the archives and we've had people say things in interviews and different things. So you get to 1987, about a year and a half after the agreement, unionism is still basically foaming at the mouth about this. But you get Peter Robinson, then deputy leader of the DUP, you get Frank Miller from the Ulster Unionist Party and Harold McCusker, who I'm pretty sure was deputy leader at that point of the Ulster Unionist Party. They come together and do this thing called the Task Force Report. It's a fascinating document, and the most compelling element of it is that it has never to this day been published. There was a sort of pressé of it that was published, which gave a pretty broad thrust of what they were saying. It was too much for either of their party leaders. Peter Robinson lost his job as deputy leader of the DUP for a number of months before Paisley basically realised that he actually needed him back, and so there was this awkward thing where he actually came back having left that role. But what that ultimately basically said is just saying no is not going to work for unionism. So very quickly you go from Paisley, the most famous Paisley clip there is anywhere, that's played over and over again in TV documentaries, where he, bellows outside Belfast City Hall, never, never, and actually says it 4 times for good effect. A brilliant piece of theatre, really caught the mood of where unionism was at that point. Very quickly, the thinking unionists are moving to say, actually, he's wrong. And that's coming from people very close to him, very close to the leadership of the Ulster Unionist Party at that point. It doesn't actually happen, but the seeds of what ultimately becomes the Good Friday Agreement are being laid there. And then you see in some of the declassified files that have been opened where publicly Unionists are saying we're not talking to British ministers as part of our protest. They're talking to them all the time, and they're talking to civil servants, whatever. So very quickly you get into something that is much more malleable beneath a very frosty surface.
Michael, do you want to come with your last point?
Just a very final couple of points. You know, to emphasise the historical significance, giving up sovereignty was not something that Margaret Thatcher was predisposed to do, and doing it under duress because she felt she was, because the IRA were not, you know, contained, was equally remarkable. Second, Fitzgerald's achievement in the 1970s with Hume and Sean Donlon and others, Michael Lillis, in winning over Irish America to constitutional nationalism, especially with what happens after the hunger strikes when the provisionals make significant inroads there, is very, very important for the peace process that comes down the line. And also on Thatcher's watch, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in some ways leads to the Brooke Initiative, the Peter Brooke Initiative. And out of that, you have the idea of replacing it with something that ends the internal exile that the Unionists find themselves in. And out of that, there's an opening that provides a framework for Republicans to come into a peace process. Whereas in 1975, they agreed a ceasefire. There was no political process for them to engage in. Sunningdale had failed. After 1994, almost a decade later, that peace process had gained some traction.
Maybe it's a good point in which to end, and I'm aware that our panel have been incredibly generous with their time and with their reflection. Resilience. Sometimes things feel really dark, but political change can happen if we stick with the process. So I think we'll end on that. We'll give a round of applause to our panel, and thank you very much.